Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Warp Core podcast. I am UrzaMaster. Joining me as always, Fert Derby and Lord Uther. Welcome, gentlemen, back on our last adventure in season 2 of Star Trek the Original Series. I'm excited to talk about today's episode. I hope you gentlemen are as well. It seems a bit like a backdoor episode, but I don't want to spoil anything. Fert Derby, take us away in the style only you can, shirtless.
Thank you, UrzaMaster. Thank you, Lord Uther. Thank you, Trekkies. And yes, me appearing naked for our final episode of Season 2 is not even the craziest thing you're going to hear about when we discuss Assignment Earth, which, as stated, was the last go-around for Season 2 of Star Trek on NBC. It was March 29th, 1968. There was actually a 1-week pause between this episode and the previous episode, Bread and Circuses. There must have been something big, Battle of the Network Stars or some other thing that preempted it. But this was the season finale. And it does not end on a cliffhanger, but as UrzaMaster suggests, the show was actually sort of conceived as what we know as a backdoor pilot. And this is a standard network television and even cable television device in which you try to expand the universe, the world, the premise of a certain show by bringing in additional guest stars or actors who take center stage more or less for that episode. So you have, an episode, say, of something we might have covered in The Graying Jedi. You have an episode of The Mandalorian which sort of focuses on Ahsoka Tano. And then Ahsoka Tano proves popular with the Star Wars fan base, as you might imagine. And then, lo and behold, within a year and a half, she has her own 8-episode streaming show, etc. But for people who didn't know Ahsoka Tano and so forth, this is their introduction to her in Chapter 13, Season 2 of The Mandalorian, which we do cover on the Graying Jedi podcast. Make sure you're checking out all of our Star Wars and Star Trek content. But that's how that works, is that you bring in a big name character or, some new actors and actresses that you want to headline their own show, and then it's like a stealth episode. They interact with the mothership, and then they get their own show if it's successful down the road. Sadly, this was a backdoor pilot that never got in the front door, and whatever plans they had for actor Robert Lansing and TV and film comedian Terry Garr making her acting debut in 1968, her first television role. Whatever plans they had to have them lead off a brand new show, unfortunately never materialized, which is too bad, because they could have had some really wacky adventures out there. And yes, Terry Garr, I had never seen her this young, this vibrant, this saucy. I remember her growing up, watching her in Close Encounters of the Third Kind and Mr. Mom and Tootsie. And she's, she was a screen actress, leading lady for several years. She retreated from full-time acting and the public eye. She was diagnosed with MS about 20 odd years ago. But she's still with us, and my research team tells me that she's living comfortably in Ohio. So it's great to see you, Terry, back when it all began. And I thought that you were one of the true highlights of this very entertaining but very wacky episode of Star Trek here. Returning champion Mark Daniels. He was behind the camera. We had a story by Gene Roddenberry and Art Wallace with a teleplay by Art Wallace. Art Wallace has only done one other episode, and it was a good one, Obsession, in Season 2 of Star Trek, and we talked about that in Warp Core 52. Go back and check out Art's work in that one. In addition to moonlighting with Star Trek, he co-created the gothic soap opera Dark Shadows with Dan Curtis. which was about Barnabas Collins and vampires and werewolves, and it was a daytime soap opera themed to the supernatural, and it achieved a cult following in the 1970s, and eventually got a big screen reboot from none other than Tim Burton, starring Johnny Depp and Chloe Grace Moretz. You probably missed it based on the box office numbers, but it is kind of worth checking out. Just kind of an odd curiosity in Tim Burton's long and storied career. And Art's wife, Elizabeth Wallace, is quite famous in soap opera circles. She was a head writer for All My Children in the 1980s. And in fact, she and Art was a story consultant for All My Children. So if you were watching that one growing up at lunchtime, at recess, you probably saw Art and Elizabeth's work for that daytime soap when they were at their height. General Hospital, All My Children, Days of Our Lives, The Young and the Restless. These were afternoon weekday staples in the Derby household. I loved Robert Lansing as Gary Seven, and I felt watching him, he was like Diet Steve McQueen. He had this face of stone, and he had this very monotone, straight ahead delivery, which sometimes Steve McQueen gave off in his performances in The Great Escape and Bullet, The Sand Pebbles. But there was just something like magnetic about him, and whenever he was on screen, even when he was doing goofy things, I'm like, I would watch a series with this guy. He and his black cat Isis and Terry Garr, unveiling conspiracies and righting wrongs in history. But I mean, again, guys, this was a crazy episode. I mean, it starts from the basic premise that the Enterprise is just allowed to time travel for the purposes of research. And I mean, time travel, at least, from my perspective in Star Trek, Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home being a big flashpoint there, it's something that's rarely used, and you only do it under the most dire of circumstances, like the Earth is being destroyed by a probe and we need to go back to grab a couple of humpback whales. But this is just kind of like, what are we doing this week? We're going back in time. Check out 1968. I feel like you guys will expound on this, but there seems so much that's wrong and so much that can go wrong with that basic thing. So right off from the jump in this episode, I'm like, it's a little weird. We did get Chekhov and Sulu together at long last. Sulu's finally finished that John Wayne picture, and so nice to see those two at the helm. When I first saw Isis the Black Cat, I said, oh no, because I've never seen a Star Trek episode where a black cat that gets featured roles can turn out well. And I'm looking at you, Cat's Paw, which again we discussed on the Warp Core. In fact, it was Warp Core 47, and that too featured a feline that hijacked the story. But in this case, Isis for the most part was well behaved, and at the end turned out to be quite more than we were expecting. So that was a nice little reveal there. Gary Seven runs around with a pen that is mightier than the sword, or even a phaser. And had we seen a full series there, we might have just seen how many different things this little doohickey can do. But I mean, it can open safes, and it can freeze people, and it can zap lasers, and this was a writing instrument with purpose. I love the 1968 office decor. I mean, that's kind of probably what it really looked like, or at least that's what the production designer said. Let's just give him a high-rise office, Midtown Manhattan or wherever. And folks, if that's what my living room or foyer could look like, I'd be all in. I just love the tackiness of it, but tackiness that didn't realize it was tacky because obviously it was 1968. So I'm sure Lord Uther will mention some of the musical selections in this show, so I'll leave that with him. But again, just some really goofy asides, like you're walking around Cape Canaveral, cue stock footage, and like you're carrying a black cat, right? I mean, was it bring your cat to the office day? Like at no point does anyone look at Gary Seven and say, hey, what are you doing with that cat? Like, I mean, that's just a very simple line, and it can be played for comic relief. But I'm just like, no one at the food truck or coming in and out of the office, none of the security are like, hey, there's a guy here, and he's like walking around with a cat. On launch day, like, doesn't that seem a bit head scratching? I love Spock in a fishing hat. I don't know why they're always coming up with ways to. In fact, he had two hats. He had a pullover winterish cap when he comes in Manhattan or wherever, and then he gets the fishing cap when that one proves to be ineffective. So Leonard Nimoy rocking it. We did get to see the original MTV logo with the stock footage of the rocket launch. So for fans of MTV in the early 80s, seeing the rocket taking off and so forth, that was all used by MTV in their ad campaigns. So I want my MTV, and we did it. But gentlemen, like I say, it certainly was entertaining, but it was kind of all over the place, and I think it kind of the representative scene was when they were Gary Seven was trying to disconnect the rocket, and he's up there on the gantry, and he's brought the cat, right? I mean, like, this is a big deal. He's trying to cut the blue wire and prevent the launch, and that darn cat is just like, crawling over his neck and his back. Is like, not now, Isis. And I'm like, I mean, you couldn't just leave her at the bottom and say, stay here, Clearly she could understand commands, but it's just like, I don't know. It was definitely not boring. Why don't we put it that way there? What was your thought of the failed to launch pilot Assignment Earth?
I gotta say, it made me a little bit wistful that we never got to see a Gary Seven series. Makes me wonder if they're ever going to tackle this in a Strange New Worlds episode.
Wouldn't that be awesome?
It would be great, and I think it would make a really good comic relief episode. A lot about this felt very comical, and it was kind of refreshing in a way. I love the time travel episodes. I love anything that comes across as like a period piece, where it's like, oh, cool, they're back in the '80s, and you can see the punk on the bus get his, his Vulcan neck pinch situation. I love that stuff. I eat it up. This episode, it just felt really goofy. Like, Kirk doesn't inherently trust the guy from the future. It seems like something Kirk would do. Just be like, okay, he must be telling the truth. He's from the future. It definitely felt ominous enough, but it didn't need to. He could have just explained, like, well, this is my cat Isis, and this is my magic pen, and I can make you do whatever I want to do. I need to get down there to stop this launch. All he had to do was say, like, unless I stop this launch, it launches World War III, and everything goes to shit. Like, you could just verbalize that. And it's not like there wasn't enough time, because there was plenty of time for hijinks for, like, a full episode. And I don't know. It's curious to me how sometimes Kirk is really adherent to duty, and like, oh, we can't interfere. We can't allow you to interfere. It's like, what are you talking about? You guys interfere all the time in everything. Like last episode, it just boggles my mind. But again, and as I argued for the previous episode, Bread and Circuses, at the time, this probably wasn't as outlandish as it is now. But I loved Terry Garr in this episode. I love how she comes across as sort of the stereotypical, sort of ditzy, super intelligent secretary, which I love as a stereotype, as a trope. I don't know why I love it. I know some might view it as demeaning, but I think it's like a Charlie's Angels situation where you can have a bombshell type character who's still super awesome. And I feel like, it is a trope. I get it, but I feel like it's an enjoyable one, and it can be empowering. So I would have loved to see Terry Garr and Robert Lansing do a show. Like, I feel like they're the little tease of, oh, you two are going to have some real history. Which is, again, goofball behavior at its best. But I would have really enjoyed to know what happens next. It's this unsolved mystery of Star Trek now, And by the way, Robert Lansing is not the same Robert that you know from Unsolved Mysteries. I had to Google it at the end of this episode because I was convinced. They have a very similar voice and even a similar face. And I think both men died of cancer. But Terry Garr's still alive, which is great. I was very happy to see that. Still, at 80 years old, an absolutely stunningly gorgeous woman. And yes, I do remember her from movies that I saw later in life. But I think really, if I'm going to say that there was an opportunity missed in this episode, it wasn't necessarily to save this episode in terms of a Warp Core rating. It was to present those two actors in a show that could have been like a Gilligan's Island level of entertaining in a sci-fi series. It's like kind of like combining Gilligan's Island and Get Smart, maybe.
Ooh.
Just enough late 60s, early 70s camp and goofiness, and of course you get the bombshells that could have come in and out. You get some interplay between this Catwoman named Isis and Terry Garr's character, a love triangle. It had all the elements. It had everything it needed. I'm actually quite flabbergasted this didn't become a show because it seems like they bought anything in the 60s. But it wasn't a spin-off, so spin-offs were the dominant factor in the 70s. Sorry if Terry Garr had been playing Maude. She might have been somebody, but there you have it.
Well, I felt like this guy was a James Bond alien time traveler type person with all the little gadgets. And by the way, who didn't have a sliding wall back in the 60s like that? Everyone wanted that. That conceals something. It was always a bar or had martini glasses part of that wall every single time. Where do I begin? It'd be nice if they referenced one of these episodes about why they shouldn't time travel. Or, I mean, maybe this is why the time travel police were made up at some point, or the correctors, or whatever that's called. I think they reference it in Voyager or something like that. So it'd be nice if they would go back to one of these episodes and kind of use that. It almost, to me, would justify the episode. Because when did they decide in Starfleet to start going back in time to observe major events? And do we just let any random starship do that? Shouldn't that be an assigned type of ship or something? It was just, and obviously it was written for the plot. I mean, but when even though it was written to be a plot piece for an episode, it affects Star Trek viewers because we are constantly going back and referencing things, right? The canon that's there. And it just, when you have something happen and then not happen again, like Spock's telekinesis that he has and things like that we never see again or see a Vulcan do, it throws us off a little bit. So I do hope they somehow reference this episode. Was it a good episode? That is the question. One that I'm struggling with right now to even go in any more detail. But do they, so what happens at the end? Doesn't he warp? Don't they warp factor away or something? It's not like they even try and travel back to the future. The episode just ends. Back to the Future. Hello. Anyway, so yeah, obviously I'm struggling with this one a little bit. It had here's what I will say. It had the groundwork for a good sci-fi episode. But again, it just seemed all over the place, like my rambling that I just did. So if you want to really know what this episode was like, go back and listen to the last minute where I've talked and just said a lot of nothing, but trying to get to a point.
Not at all, not at all. I actually think the episode's biggest crime, again, it's not boring, is because they were treating it as a backdoor pilot, it doesn't feel like there's enough with the crew. Like, there are literally stretches of this episode where Spock and Kirk are standing at mission control, and they're just standing there. And you think, well, these are very proactive guys. Every time they're locked in a cell or every time they're taken prisoner, they're always hatching plots to escape and turn the tables and fix the problem. But here, Jim's like, I've never felt so helpless. and they're just kind of standing there, and everyone's like T minus 15 seconds to launch, and it's Gary Seven obviously who's supposed to and the computer and Terry Garr and the cat that are supposed to save the day so they can get their own show later. But it was just like they seemed curiously ineffective, like they weren't really helping drive the story. And again, that's by design. Yeah, they took a back seat, but literally took a back. Like they could have made it in such a way that it looked like they were contributing, but like I say, they're just kind of standing around, like, well, I mean, I guess we just stand here, Jim? I mean, it's like they're not really. That was one thing that did kind of stand out to me. Like, give them something to do, or put them out of the way so that they can't. We've got to get out of this cell, Spock, or we're trapped in traffic, or just something that sort of like they can't be a part of the solution. So I just thought that was a little, they could have tweaked that ever so slightly.
Well, and that brings a question to mind. What about the mission control guys when they just disappeared? Well, what? They just go, oh, those guys are gone. Rocket took off. Let's all go home. Like, where's the panic? Like, where did those Ruskies go? Clearly they're spies. Like, this is 1968. This is like Red Panic. No, they don't just roll over. We saw this, like, even in Star Trek 4, they panicked a little more when Chekhov was found on the nuclear sub. Like, no, no. But I think we've belabored this episode. Suffice to say, it's interesting. But before we get to our Warp Core ratings, this is the last episode of season 2, and it's been a season, to say the least. Some ups, some downs, some in betweens. Gentlemen, what are your favorite and least favorite episodes of season 2? Fert Derby, let's kick it off with you.
Well, the good thing about having 20 plus episodes to choose from is that there was a big menu of selections, both good and frankly maybe not so good. On the good side of the ledger, I mean, you might remember that we've discussed episodes like The Changeling and Mirror Mirror. That was in Warp Core 45. We talked about Journey to Babel in Warp Core 49. Wolf in the Fold in Warp Core 53. The Trouble with Tribbles in Warp Core 54. These are all very good episodes of Star Trek. Foundational episodes in places that gave us rich backstory, characters, plot, humor, excitement. But I think for my favorite of season 2, I think I'm going to surprise my fellow Starfleet Academy wingmen, but maybe not eagle-eyed and sharp Warp Core fans, because I gave this episode a 7 out of 7 Warp Cores not too long ago, and it's By Any Other Name. And we talked about that in episode 61. The shorthand was, those are the godlike beings that turn everyone on the Enterprise into crushable cubes. And then Kirk has to flirt with one of the aliens to make the head alien jealous, and so forth. And I said at the time, because I actually went back and watched Warp Core 61 just so we would be on the same page. I said that this was like pure Star Trek, just mainlined into my veins. For all of its good and its bad and it's just plain crazy, this was the episode that I would have taken to Viridian 3 or Nimbus 5. This episode to me encapsulated the very best and the very out there of Star Trek. So my favorite episode of this season is By Any Other Name. We also had some ones that didn't quite run through the tape. And I mean, Who Mourns for Adonis in Warp Core 44. The Apple in Warp Core 46. Cat's Paw in Warp Core 47. The Omega Glory and the U.S. Constitution reading in Warp Core 62. But I think also patient Warp Core fans know that I hold a special scorn for the Gamesters of Triskelion in Warp Core 55. And you can go back and see how much I disliked that particular episode and what it suggested and its general ugliness. and I won't belabor those points, but that to me represented the floor of season 2. So by any other name, really good. Gamesters of Triskelion needs a rewrite, and that's where I come down on season 2, which again had a lot of highs and it had a few lows.
I'll go next. Oh wait, am I doing my favorites first? My favorite.
Well, however,
okay.
yeah.
You know, I'm gonna go Mirror Mirror because it sets up so many other great episodes, and to me, it's kind of the Mount Everest of what ifs, in a sense.
And Elseworlds, yeah.
And we've and obviously Star Trek has dabbled in that universe a few different times in different series. So I'm gonna go Mirror Mirror with that. Now, there's so many to choose from for worst. I just, where do I begin? It's for me, it's a tie between the apple and cat's paw, and I'm so tempted to go with the apple, but I'm gonna go with cat's paw because it plays out like I had said in our previous episode, like a very bad D&D gaming session. So cat's paw is like a bunch of, it's just not good. So for me, I'm gonna leave it at that. But of course, no bad episode will ever be any worse than the one that Fert always tells me about, because I don't even remember its name, because every time I say it, it just goes away like midichlorian. Like it just goes away.
The affirmative factor, is that the
one where he,
the alternative factor.
Yes,
Alternative
where he's
factor?
yes. See, I don't even.
Yep.
It's like midichlorian. Don't know what it means. Don't care. So, yeah, those are my. That's my favorite and my least, and then I give a warp core rating after UrzaMaster does his favorite.
Yes, and this season, I have a love-hate relationship with, because so many of these episodes had such promise and ended up being such letdowns. And so many of these episodes started out middling and ended up being great. My favorite is going to be Return to Tomorrow. I think the start of that episode was like, I don't know where this is headed. But by the end, I was hooked. I loved that episode. I mean, and I'm a bit of a sucker for Dr. Pulaski. Who am I to pretend? But I do think that is the episode where we get to see sides of Leonard Nimoy that I don't think we really get to see at all throughout his career. Hardly. And that, to me, was probably the most enjoyable experience this season in terms of just sheer interplay between the cast and crew. Very few sets. It was almost a episode in a bottle, and I like those. As far as the least favorite, I'm going to have to go with the Omega Glory. I don't mean to use recency bias, but I think for me, bad episodes that start off bad or are continually bad throughout, I can sort of appreciate. Like Cat's Paw, it was kind of crappy from the start. So I really didn't ever get a high bar of expectations. I was like, yeah, this isn't a great episode, but is it the worst? Not really. The Omega Glory had every promise of being a great episode and then completely destroyed itself in the third act. And that was like the world's hardest gut punch. And every time I was like struggling with this decision, every time I tried to think like, well, I actually kind of like Who Mourns for Adonis, because of all of the Star Trek holiday things I could find, I found this like at a closeout sale at an Ace Hardware that was closing. I'm like, all right, how do you argue with that? That's just awesome. And then every other episode is just like, yeah, but I never really thought this was going to be all that good, so it wasn't that disappointing. So when something good did happen, it kind of rose the bar. Omega Glory started out like, ooh, this is getting good. Oh, this is good. Oh, this is interesting. Ah, at the end. And that's just, to me, the worst in television. When it grabs you, holds you, and then throws you into the muck pit. You might as well just leave me in the Sarlacc with Boba Fett because can't do it. So yeah, I'm going to go with Omega Glory as the low point for me this season. But I recommend anybody fresh to the original series, if you've been with us on this ride through these 26 episodes, go back. Think about each one, listen to our commentary, make sure you watch that full Warp Core on that episode you're thinking might be your least favorite, because there might be something worthwhile. That being said, gentlemen,
Let's not forget the Assignment Earth real quick. Let's give those a Warp Core.
This final episode, I'm going to kick off our Warp Cores.
Right.
I really liked it. It was all over the place, but it was interesting. It was definitely a bit of a teaser for me. But I enjoyed a lot of this. Terry Garr was a shining star. I'm going to give it a 5 out of 7 Warp Cores. I thought it was really good, although it never quite got to where I wanted it to. I enjoyed it thoroughly. Fert Derby, how about you?
I'm with you. I'm with a 5. I was never bored. There are some things that absolutely I question. But like you say, it plays light, and the light stuff to me makes me laugh instead of cringe. So I'm with you. That's a 5.
I'm going to go 5.5.
Ooh,
because Terry Garr is good in anything.
nice.
So I will just leave it at that. Real quick, I just want to reference something that I think Fert Derby put it perfectly, which is tough for someone who loves the Phantom Menace. But I love that he said, and you even alluded to it too, UrzaMaster, a lot of these episodes could have used a rewrite. And if they would have approached it that way, I think the season could have been stronger than it was. Because to me, it still doesn't compare to the first season. And I'm sure, too, with the first season, there's just something to be said about, hey, it's new. It's probably, some of those episodes get people hooked on Star Trek and things like that. And we see a couple episodes here that maybe could have had people get hooked on Star Trek, but not as many as the first season. But I think if they would have sat down and, whether it was a time crunch or writers or whatever, and just rewritten different pieces, it could have been a much stronger season. So I guess I just reflected upon the season a little bit too. But this is another episode where I think with just some tighter writing or not putting Star Trek so far in the background of it, and again, I get what they were trying to do, but it's like Star Trek was not even secondary. It was like thirtiary or fourthiary or fiftiary to everything else, and it could have been stronger if that wasn't the case. So that's all I have to say about that.
Very nice. And, a little foreshadowing that can't wait to get through Next Gen with this crew just to see which is better, the original series or Next Generation, and which put Star Trek truly on the map. But before we ever even come close to that, we still have a third season to go, which we will get to next time. And until then, live long and prosper.